Hi, everybody, and good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy, and tonight's session is an ongoing series that we're doing, going through the chapters in my newest book. For those of you who have been waiting, and I've been promising for a couple of months now, my book, The Audacity to Be You, Learning to Love Your Horrible Rotten Self, is out on audio version. You can get it on iTunes, on Audible, or on Amazon. And this time I read it with I was the one who narrated it. So as I start this chapter, we've talked about kind of the heroic journey inward. We've talked about finding yourself as a process. And like a lot of principles in self-help psychology, relationship psychology, a lot of times when we study something, we study it in reference to something else. And so it's interesting that as I begin to talk about what it means to be intimate and be connected to other people in our lives, that one of the first things that we start to describe is boundaries. And I want to pause for a moment and just highlight that idea that as we talk about connection, as we talk about intimacy with other people in our lives, we're going to first and foremost talk about boundaries. And not because it's a warning, not because that's kind of a side idea, but because boundaries themselves are critical ingredients in intimacy. The lack of boundaries that I think not most of us, everybody mistakes the lack of boundaries or diffuse boundaries with intimacy. And that's why, as I talk tonight, I'll talk about the idea that when somebody sets healthy boundaries with us, or when we set healthy boundaries with other people, that the experience on the other end of the equation is abandonment or coldness. So to begin with, the chapter begins with, ironically, we cannot have a conversation about connection without talking about boundaries. Boundaries allow for connection. Similar to the way that we talked about the sense of self, developing your own identity is the first ingredient in establishing connection and intimacy with other people. Boundaries allow for connection. Otherwise, the relationship is comprised of two compromised selves and lacks essential ingredients in intimacy. So one of the things that we learn first in this chapter is the idea that our lack of boundary keeping, our lack of boundary setting, is a barrier to intimacy, to connection, to seeing other people. The chapter title is Finding Others. And the reason why that's so important to me is because the idea, and others, somebody asks this question often, what is it? Why do you use the word other when you talk about self-help and relationship psychology? Because it represents any other person in our life. So the phrase could be equally other person. We could substitute other person for others. So as we begin this evening and talk about it, and you evaluate your own relationships with your children, with your spouses, with your friends, colleagues, with your acquaintances, with your extended family, just know that we're talking about some core ideas that exist in all of those relationships. Yes, of course, there are different aspects that define a healthy relationship between a parent and a child when compared to, for example, two partners, a couple in a marriage. But we're not going to focus on those differences tonight. We'll get into that when we get into some of the later chapters. We're going to talk about what does it mean to be in relationship to another person? What does it mean to love, to see another person? What does it mean to be able to relate to other people in this process? So I love this quote. This is what I use for the chapter epigraph. Prentice Hemphill is the author. I found it on their website. I reached out to them, and they had it nowhere else besides on their social media, and just told me to cite their website. But Prentice Hemphill talks about this idea that boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. I could talk about this quote for the rest of the evening. Boundaries are the distance at which I can love you and me simultaneously. So sometimes our unhappiness, our anger, our discontent is because we're trying to force ourselves to be in relationship with somebody that doesn't allow for love to exist, that doesn't allow for us to respect ourselves. We have to, in other words, compromise who we are, or to talk about it more plainly, we have to discard our feelings, to not feel hurt or frustrated or angry. Some part of who we are has to be discarded if I'm going to be in close proximity to you. That's a boundary violation. So if I have to be compromised, or on the other side of the equation, if you have to be compromised, then we really can't have intimacy. Because remember, if we were baking a cake called intimacy, the first ingredients in that cake would be two whole selves, or striving or approaching wholeness, because nobody's perfectly whole, of course. We're all on a continuum. But the more whole we are, the more individual we are, the more our sovereign sense of self is intact, the more capable we are of intimacy. So when I hear people trying to negotiate, should I let my young adult child live with me? Should I stay married? Should I get married? Should I allow my child to move in? First of all of those sentences I just uttered have the word should in them. So immediately we have to find another way to think about that, right? We have to talk about what works for us. But the question comes back to this point. It's about, can you? Can you have them move in and still love them? I make the joke, and luckily my mother won't listen to this podcast, but the joke that I tell to illustrate it is the distance between my mother and I, for example, is 650 miles, give or take. That's the right distance for me. My son is in college right now. He's about 2,300 miles away from me right now. And that was the distance that he chose to be at, away from us. And when we talk about our wilderness therapy program, about taking children from the home or having parents send them away from home to us, that movement, that distance allows us as therapists, as facilitators, to begin to establish an intimate and connected relationship. We have to pull it apart to work on, if you will, to be consistent with the analogy, to work on the individual parts first. In other words, the distance is a move towards intimacy and towards connection. And part of what I haven't told the story in many years, actually, about a student who was asking for a phone call with his parents, sometimes often very eager to talk to their parents again. And I was waiting for it to be the right time. And just as I was approaching the time when I thought they were ready to have a phone call together, that it would be appropriate in the context of the clinical work that we were doing, the dad wrote a very honest and courageous letter to his son, talking about his own grappling with addiction. And it was honest, it was accountable. Dad was going to get help while the child was away. And the dad confessed to some pretty significant violations in the father-son, father-child relationship. Driving under the influence, for example. And as the son read this letter, he felt the weight and the power of the honesty and the courage in his father. And sometime in the middle of the therapy session, after reading the letter, I mentioned to him that I'm offering the phone call to you now. The phone call is on the table for you. And I had some reservations because this was such a heavy letter. And the son said to me in session, I think I want to wait a week. Because if I talk to my father this week, I need to digest this letter. In other words, I need some time away from him to make sense out of it first, so that when I show up in relationship with my father, I won't lose myself. And that is probably the most beautiful and simple story to illustrate what it means to be in a relationship. I have to first settle this. What's going on inside of me, in my heart and mind. And when that is settled enough, when that becomes less vulnerable, less of a transient state. Then I can be in relationship with you without the temptation to lose myself. A fantastic illustration of that. I talk about this idea that there's a big shift in this chapter is about setting boundaries, not to teach somebody a lesson or to change them, but to take care of myself. Now, I want to be as clear as I can with all of you. Setting boundaries does impact other people. Setting boundaries does tend to influence other people in our lives. They have to respond to us. Think of a cornerstone in the foundation of a building. The cornerstone becomes the reference point to which all other aspects of the house kind of line up, right? That's the reference point, so they know their place. They know where they fit. It sets the standard for the angles of the house, of the foundation. And in clear boundaries in oneself does that for other people. That there's a phrase that a therapist used called become the immovable object. He called it. He talked about it in reference to being a therapist in a session. When you become the immovable object, and I'm not talking about rigid, knee-jerk inflexibility. I'm talking about when you get clear about who you are, then other people have to get to decide. They get to decide if they want to be in relationship with us. But what we're not negotiating, if we adopt that stance that the idea of the immovable object offers, what we're not negotiating is our feelings, our story, our truth, our beliefs. And so our boundaries become not necessarily a manipulative tool, a clever way of impacting people, but what do I need to do to be safe? Now, in the role of parents, more than any other role, those are going to have more significant influence and impact on our children. Makes sense, right? Because my boundaries would be, I'm not comfortable with you going out tonight, or I'm not comfortable with you getting in that car or going to that party, or I am comfortable with you getting in that car or going to that party, right? This is what I need to do to feel good about myself in a role of a parent. I was talking to some parents recently, coaching them around the language that they might have in holding a boundary with their child about being at evoke therapy programs, being in our wilderness program. And the language that we came up with together is, I'm not ready for you to come home yet. And that phrase owns the decision. And the child could complain and say things like, well, I hope you get ready. And you can respond with, I'm going as fast as I can. I'm eager also to get to a place where you coming home will be good for both of us. So we set boundaries not to manipulate or change or affect others, but they do that. And one of those decisions that may come out of a boundary is people may leave us. They may withdraw affection or attention. They might shut down. They may divorce us. They might fire us from a job or quit the company that we run. All of those choices you have no control over, but most of us are attending to try to make sure that all of those decisions go the way that we want them to. So what do? We don't set boundaries because the risk is that people could leave us. People could withdraw from us. So boundary setting is an incredibly courageous experience. And that's why for me, I have to develop an anchor, resources in my life, so that if I set a boundary with you, which is going to be scary, I can draw upon the resources that I have in my life, my support group, my mentor, my sponsor, my therapist, in my case, my wife. It goes back to the idea too that boundary setting is not that developing or healing our codependent trait, that is our lack of healthy boundaries, doesn't make us more passive. Boundary setting is a courageous, authentic, bold decision that we make in our lives, often terrifying because of the potential consequences. All of these are quotes from my book, just taking them out to kind of take you through it from this chapter. Again, I say the shift here is that our boundaries aren't about changing other people. Boundaries are about self-care. I talk about this dialogue that I had with a colleague of mine some years ago, where they asked me about how good my boundaries were. And I paused for a moment to consider the question because it's not a simple answer, because at sometimes in my life, boundaries are easier for me. Sometimes they're more challenging. Certain relationships and circumstances, I find them easier or harder than others. So as I was gathering myself to answer the question, they inserted this qualifying part of the question, saying, for example, if a client called you on a Sunday, would you make sure not to answer the question so your client wouldn't call you back, or would know not to call you on Sundays? It was an emergency. And I said, now I understand your question. I don't not answer the phone call. I don't not answer the Sunday phone call to try to teach them a lesson. But it does teach them a lesson. Right? If I answer it, I reinforce them calling and give them the attention. If I don't answer it, they learn that I'm not available on Sunday. But I make the decision from, ideally, I try to find inside myself what works for me and what doesn't. So boundaries are about maintaining yourself so you can see and relate to others in an authentic way. Here's what I write here. Even with children, this kind of thinking can be applied. Instead of saying, you can't stay at Darcy's house for a sleepover, you're too young, or clean your room before you can play, you need to learn that work comes before play. We can say instead, I'm not comfortable yet with you having a sleepover, or I may be old-fashioned or a little neurotic, but I need you to clean your room before you can play. And we start to establish something that is worth its weight in gold, right? That is so valuable for children, which is we start to establish our selfhood. We own it. We take the risk. We get out of the being right mindset and into the being a self mindset. And our children learn. So what do? They go out in the world and they become more capable of setting boundaries with people in their intimate relationships. And of course, we want them to have that skill set, that safety. Some might argue, and I wouldn't be surprised if there aren't comments and questions either rattling around in your head or even submitted already to my moderator at this time. But some argue, if my decisions as a parent are based on what I feel comfortable with, well then, aren't I just asking my child to take care of me? And of course, my answer is absolutely not. You're taking care of yourself. You're demonstrating that you can take care of yourself. And when they get upset or frustrated or disappointed with you and you don't capitulate, you're modeling that you're taking care of you and they don't have to. I want to pause for a moment, and I can't say this more emphatically. This is hard stuff. Setting boundaries, getting clear, speaking our truth, relating to other people in this loving, compassionate, clear way. And I'm not there yet. And I suspect none of you are either. So I'm not suggesting that after this broadcast you can do it perfectly or that I do it perfectly. I'm setting a bar or a North Star about what it looks like, what the project is. This is the project. Chapter 1 talks about who you are. And as we move, chapter 2 talks about who you are, finding you. As we move into chapter 3, we begin to say, and how do we regard the other? How do we see and love and connect others with others? And so that first step, the first idea as we transition from self to others is where those two things meet. It's the boundary. There's a line out of the musical Wicked. If you've seen the musical Wicked on Broadway or off Broadway, you might recognize at the end of the first act the song that comes to a crescendo called Defying Gravity, where the Wicked Witch, Elphaba, is being asked to collude with the wizard, right? To support and defend his pretense that he's his idea that he's a wizard. And he offers her basically his kingdom with her, to share it with her, and talks about how they can rule the world together. And as she considers his offer, she finds herself unwilling to sacrifice who she is, her boundaries, her integrity, her truth. And a highlight of the song is she says, if this is love, if what you're asking me is love, it comes at much too high a cost. It's the same thing in our intimate relationships with our partners or our children. If they ask us for something that's outside of an important aspect, characteristic, attribute, belief, value of who we are, we get to decide, is that too high of a cost? Now, if you ask me, can we take an alternative route to the restaurant tonight? Of course, I'm going to give that up. That's not a core value. But if you ask me to compromise a more significant value, a more fundamental value, I get to decide. I get to decide if that's too much, and you get to decide. And by the way, Dr. Brad Reedy or any other therapist in the world doesn't get to decide your boundaries. That's why the question of what should I do with my son or daughter? What should I do with my spouse, with my girlfriend, with my boyfriend, with my colleague? That's not a question that we can answer in this model. None of those questions can be answered if we're using this model. Our question would be, tell me more about that. What would it mean for you to be in a relationship with this person? What would it mean for you to allow your child to still live at home? Well, he wants to smoke pot and play video games all day. How do you feel about that? I can't stand it. It drives me crazy. Well, then I think you have your answer. But shouldn't I? And then I stop you and I say, there's no should in this model. In developing a sense of self and loving others, there's no should. There's just what you can. Should you forgive your father or your grandfather for abusing you? I don't get to decide that. Wouldn't even make sense for me to decide that. The question is, can you? Can you live with this person? Can you be in business with this person? Can you be friends with this person? And that's an answer that only you can answer, because the answer comes from you and who you are. Going on, I write, when those we love are struggling, we take care of our feelings so that our interactions with them, especially our children, can focus on responding to their needs and not our needs. I talk about this consistently. It's probably most important in the context of parenting, because our job in that relationship is to support children, right? They're smaller than us, not just physically, but psychologically. We occupy a very large space in the child's psyche and mind. And hopefully they occupy less space, psyche, and mind. In other words, they don't take care of us. We don't see ourselves through their eyes. We don't depend upon them for who we are. Whereas vice versa, it is the case. So we go to places where we can be anxious and afraid and frustrated and angry and confused. And we go there as often as we need. Ideally, we develop a practice of self-care and maintenance through therapy or support groups or good, trusted friendships. And we talk about what we're feeling. We struggle in those relationships, in those conversations, so that when we come back to the child, we're relating to them not on an empty stomach, but full, more complete, and more clear. And we're oriented then in what can I do to support you? And we go back to the original thought in this chapter is that request, that thing you're asking for, does it ask too much of me? When people ask me kind of the moment of truth questions, like how much is too much? How much is too far? Am I a doormat or am I generous? Am I compromising past the point where I end up losing myself, or am I showing flexibility? The answer to all of those questions, folks, is that's the right question. And it's one that you get to decide. Now, as a therapist or a friend, I can reflect back what I'm seeing. I can say it sounds like going home for the holidays is a miserable experience for you. I wrote a blog called Why You Shouldn't Go Home for Thanksgiving. And I did use the word should in the title to catch people's attention. In fact, Malia, you can post it on from drbradreedy.com or just Google it with my name. And essentially what I say is it's okay not to go home for Thanksgiving. This is aside from COVID. You don't have to go. If you can go home and it feels like a safe, welcoming place to be, then you go home. If you go home because your level of detachment is advanced to a level that even if people are saying things that are against your values, that it doesn't cut into you too deeply, then you go home. Maybe you go home to see how far along you've come, or to see if they're the same as you imagine them. But maybe you stay away, and that's okay too. And so part of the process of relating to other people is if you show up with a significantly compromised sense of yourself, you're not in relationship with them. You've left you behind. Let's imagine that you live in New York and they live in California. If you show up having to discard, to ignore, to dismiss critical elements of who you are for it to work out at home in Los Angeles, if that's what it requires, you're not in relationship to them. You're not even there. You're back in New York. So you show up as a shell of yourself. And so you're not even present with the others. Just a kind of engineered false self shows up to the process, to the visit. Talking about being right, this chapter talks about it clearly. Thank you for posting the blog, Malia, from my website. Regarding being right, most people don't think feelings are enough. They think they have to be right to prove themselves in a virtual court, sitting in, and our best guesses are all that we have. Anything else is a paper tiger, something we try to use to influence the opinions of others that we are right. But, in fact, boundaries are not about being right, they're about being a self. In this way of thinking, and this could be the thesis of my book, in this way of thinking, you don't get to be right anymore. But you do get to be a self. And being a self is so much better. So this work that I do with parents so often is to say, are you willing to escape the paradigm and the thinking of your family of origin, and to bring this new work to your children, and to pass on to them a legacy where they don't have to be right. They don't have to defend themselves. They don't have to prove themselves. They just get to be themselves. And if something feels uncomfortable, it's okay. But to model that for them, we've got to stand in relationship to them in this same way, which means they get to be angry or disappointed. It argued that it's important for children to be angry and disappointed in us. It helps them develop a sense of themselves, right? I talk about boundaries all the time, but talking about it for about the last year in these terms, we have to learn to disappoint people. You know, when people learn these concepts, they say, but what do I need to do? What does it take? And my answer is it takes a willingness to confront your greatest fear, that you're a monster, that you're selfish, that you're self-centered, that you don't care, that you don't love them, that you've abandoned them. Pick your adjective. Pick your description. For us to set boundaries, we have to face our dragons. The dragons that tell us what we should and shouldn't do. And not only do we face them intrapsychically, meaning inside our own heads, we face them because our children and our spouses and our friends and our coworkers and our mothers and our fathers and our brothers and our sisters voice them to us. They tell us we're being selfish or uncaring. But if we take the step, we do the work, face our greatest fears, we learn how to let other people down and disappoint people. As somebody just asked me this last intensive, there's salvation on the other side. On the other side, we get to be in a relationship with somebody, with an other. I've learned something about intimate relationships. My capacity to love you is linked to whether or not I'm allowed to be myself in your presence and have that be tolerated. I'm going to say that again. My ability to love you, my feeling of affection, of passion in whatever form relationship it's where it's appropriate, a parent or a child or a brother or sister, a friend or a colleague. My ability to love you, my inclination to love you is linked to how much I'm allowed to be myself in your presence and have that be okay. So we learn to be a self. We model being a self. And we also realize that we have to, we're in relationship with human beings, fallible, imperfect human beings, limited human beings. And so it's not that everybody, we included, have to be omniscient, omnipotent, omnipotent. It's not that we have to have endless amounts of flexibility and patience. It's just critical that we own them. That from day to day and year to year and moment to moment, we learn to say to each other, like, this is what I can and can't do. And if there's something like physical abuse in our relationship, that's a value that I have that is consistent over time. And I'm not willing to be in a relationship where I'm physically afraid of my safety. So I can't be in this relationship. If you're going to talk to me that way, I can't be in this relationship. I'm not threatening you to get you to change your behavior. I really can't. This is not a negotiation or a ploy or a tactic. It's a statement of truth and of fact. And you'll know it's true because I'll follow through on it. And if it gets to be too bad, if the behavior is abusive enough, and I decide to sever the friendship, my words will be, you don't have to change. You can be being exactly as you are. I just can't be here anymore. Loving others, trying something other, trying to be a good something or other is the enemy of growth, connection, and love. There's a great difference between loving somebody and trying to get them to feel love. Read that again. There's a great difference between loving someone and trying to get them to feel love. For one, you have control over, and one you don't. The former comes from a place of giving, and the latter is from a place of needing something from the other. I cannot control whether you feel abandoned by me. And if that's my project, my goal, I'll be constantly imprisoned in our relationship. I'll be held hostage by my need to control how you feel about me. But if I learn what love is and learn how to show up, I can live with that. You might not interpret it the way that it's intended, but I have no control over that. I had a young man saying, my father doesn't care about me in the wilderness. Many of the children say this, right? It's how they've hooked their parents. It's one of the most common things a child will express to a parent, which is, you don't love me, or you've abandoned me, or you don't care. Others include, you're being unfair, unreasonable. But this young man said, my father doesn't love me, doesn't care. And I said, I've never seen a father go to such lengths to try to prove to his son that he loved him more than your father has for you. All of the extra efforts that he's made. And I told him something that he didn't know. I said, your father was in our program yesterday and the day before. He didn't come to your group because it's not the right time yet, but he went to another group and he visited the boys in another group to be sure that this was a place that he felt comfortable having somebody that he cared so much for. I gave other examples that were not in dispute about things the father had made. And I said to the son at the end of this, the 15-year-old boy at the end of this speech I was giving, I said, so if you haven't felt loved by your father and cared for by your father up to this point, I don't think you're ever going to feel it. And I don't think there's anything he can do. And the young man didn't say much, but he started to realize, started to hear. And the dad started to learn that this old pattern of manipulation, this old pattern of change back to prove to me how you feel, was going to dissipate in this family. If the goal is to be a good something or other, you're doing it in service of your ego. But if you love and are kind and are giving, by definition, those actions come from a place of capacity. Maybe most simply put is the idea that you don't get to win anymore. And this way of thinking, you don't get to win. Constantly, I'm using this as a mantra for myself and others. People often present me unwinnable problems, unsolvable problems. They'll give me a circumstance with somebody in their life, and they'll say, should I do A or should I do B? And I know we're up for a trap, because if I suggest, let's go with A, they tell me how A will fail them. And if I say, well, then let's go with B, well, B has its own problems. I will fail in quite a different way. I learned in working with borderline clients, and I won't go into that diagnosis this evening, that the deal is you don't get to win anymore. You get to choose how to lose. That idea of choosing how to lose means that you free yourself to be in relationship to somebody else in an honest and authentic way. You surrender control. It starts to be the essence and the definition of a relationship with somebody. Whereas if I'm trying to win, if I'm trying to get the outcomes that I want, I'm not in relationship with a person. I'm in relationship with an object. And what people don't like to hear that struggle with codependency, because often they experience it as a weakness, as a failing. What people don't understand is that, and with a slight shift in perspective, we can understand very clearly that codependency is about controlling everybody. It's about playing God in all of your relationships. Like I said the other night, the difference between God and me is God never thinks that he's me. So to be in relationship to others, we have to surrender the idea that we can control them, that we can win. And we get to choose how to lose. Another way of saying so much of what we've already been saying tonight. I was observing a therapist out in the field. And this young person happened to suffer some pretty significant trauma in her life with parents that were gone or unavailable to her through literal abandonment. And I think one of them might have even been serving time in prison. So the grandparents stepped in. And I was doing what I do when I work with our therapists, which I go out and I shadow them and I work on training and teaching. So I'm sitting with the primary therapist and the young woman. The primary therapist had decided that we would meet with the young woman first during our visit. The young woman was struggling significantly. We'll call her Bella. Bella, excuse me. So we met with Bella first, and Bella was upset and frustrated and complaining about a feeling of abandonment with her therapist. She mentioned last week, you didn't give me enough time. And the therapist said, Bella, I actually met with you more than everybody else. In fact, I met with you twice. Well, the second meeting was only 15 minutes. And then you left. And I saw you laughing with the staff. And I know you were laughing at me. I saw you glance over at me before you chuckled. And the therapist was trying to soothe her and convince her that she loved her, that she was a good, loving therapist that cared about her. And after watching this power struggle go on for a while, I offered my idea. I offered my thoughts on the matter, asked them if they were both open to it, which they both were. And I said to the therapist, she had asked the question, what can I do, Bella, to prove to you that I care? And that's when I jumped in and I said, my idea is you can't do anything. Bella doesn't live in a paradigm, in a world where adults care about her. The ones that are supposed to be there for her have both abandoned her. One when she was very young, the father, and one more recent, addiction, and her mother serving time in prison. So instead of trying to be something Bella cannot actually imagine, because even if you love her, she's going to leave our program in a couple of months, and you're not going to be in her life. Even if you maintain some contact with her, it won't be significant. And we can't, as therapists, give all of our clients the rest of our lives, right? We would run out of time and energy and resources. And so I said, so maybe we just have to sit with Bella in the pain of the idea that she feels unloved and unwanted, and that there's no way you can prove to her otherwise. And again, I offered the idea, and I looked to Bella and I said, how do you think about that? And she said, that makes sense. I can't argue with that. And later I said to the therapist, you can't win. You can't be good. And your desire or efforts to be good will be the thing that rob you of your authenticity and freedom. You just have to learn to be a self, to be a person, a fallible, imperfect, limited person. I hear the euphemism very often in my career as I see self-help teachers and books talk about this. I understand that it's a euphemism often offered to parents to kind of soothe their anxiety. This idea of loving too much. It's a psychological reframe that's supposed to take hovering, anxious parenting behaviors and reframing it as something positive, like loving too much. That the lack of boundaries is somehow too much love. That's the idea that people are trying to sell. Instead, I offer this idea. It is common to conflate love or loving too much with anxious attachment. Loving too much is a euphemism for the unhealed attachment wound and its expression in an anxious parent. The problem in these interactions and relationships is not loving too much, but rather not enough self. And while I want every parent, every person to be comforted, to not shame themselves and not beat themselves up for their fallibility, the idea that anxious attachment is the same thing as loving too much, I think does more damage than it does good. The reason that we develop these anxious attachments of trying to take care of our children's suffering or their anxiety, their pain, their sadness, their fears, that we make up for their mistakes, right? We enable and excuse their behaviors. We avoid setting difficult boundaries. The reason we do all of that is because we don't have enough self. Because we weren't raised to become a self. We were raised to become an extension of our parents. And how they felt about us, was supposed to be our indication of how well we were doing. And we take that relationship, or object as they call it in some psychological models, we take the object of the parent, the idea of the parent, the position of the parent, and we transfer it onto the child. And we become consumed by whether or not the child thinks that we're a good parent, whether we love them enough, whether we're abandoning them. And we have to tolerate in all of our relationships. If we are to evolve, we have to tolerate the feedback, the sense from other people that we are not enough. I talk about in this chapter a great podcast. If you're looking at the screen today or on the YouTube channel watching this, it's called Invisibilia by NPR. It's a series called Invisibilia by NPR. And the specific episode was offered to me by a parent in our New York City parent support group before the days of COVID. It's called The Problem with the Solution, and the episode is July 1st, 2016. So if you're watching, you could take a shot with your camera. And she talks about this town in Belgium called Hale, Belgium. I believe it's spelled G-E-L. And in Hale, there is this monument dedicated to the patron saint of mental health. And so there over decades have been people taking a pilgrimage to find healing from their mental health ailments. So the research of this research was to study this place, this community. And among other things, she finds that people in the town take on these visitors as boarders. They house them. There's a psychiatrist that kind of manages the town. And as you walk around town, and she says, you might go to a coffee shop and you would see somebody in active psychosis being treated, she says, with the same deference as anybody else, the same respect. And she starts to talk to these families that take on these boarders. To give you a sense of it, the average boarder stays with their family. The average boarder stays with the family for 28 years. That's the average length of stay. That's significant. So what she finds, which is remarkable, is that some of these families have their own children that they have conflict with and end up not being able to stay with. And their children have much less severe problems than the boarders. So why is it that you can deal with a boarder who's in active psychosis and you can't deal with a 19-year-old young adult child who's not motivated. Why that difference? So she studies deeper and further, and she discovers that they talk and relate differently to the boarders than they do to their own children. And she identifies 3 ways in which they operate and relate differently between the boarders and their children. And with their children, they tend to respond more with anger, criticism, and what she describes as over-involved language. Anger and criticism makes sense, being angry, that there's something in the relationship that's there's more to it. There's more at stake with the child. There's more identity over identification with the child. There's more wrapped up in that. So the anger and the criticism causes the child to respond in fight or flight ways. They do brain scanning to study the different kinds of ways the parents talk. And of course, it makes sense to all of us that if you're criticized or somebody gets angry at you, you're going to feel threatened. The part of your brain that is the fight or flight part of your brain is going to be activated. But the fascinating part, the reason I tell this story, is because she discovers that the brain responds the exact same way to the anger and the criticism as it does toward the over-involved language. And the example that she gives sounds like this. I would do anything to make my child happy. I would go to the ends of the earth and sacrifice anything I could so that they could have a decent life. That kind of statement gets interpreted by the child as a threat. And she hypothesizes that it's because it's too consuming. There's a loss of self and separateness in it. And so while we might think that kind of language, I would do anything for my child type of language, is an expression of love, the child experiences it as a threat to their sovereignty of self, to who they are, to their independence. And so we begin to understand that boundaries and shifting the way that we relate to others creates the possibility for intimacy and connection. And what we have been trained by our own family of origin, by our culture, that somehow, I talk about this all the time, that there's some aspiration to the idea of I'm only happy as my least happy child, that the fact that I can't sleep at night and communicating that to the child, or just telling the child how worried or frustrated or sad or scared you are because they're using illicit drugs, that somehow that's an expression of love, and the child is going to respond to that expression of love by sitting up straight and flying right, the child experiences that as a burden. They experience that as a threat. On top of whatever mental health issues they have, now they have to carry your well-being on top of that. So the heroic work is often called learning to detach. And I teach this all the time to you on these podcasts. But when we say learning to detach, we're really talking about learning to develop relationships that have the qualities of healthy attachment. Because that over-involved language that I was just using, that's not interpreted by the other person as attachment. That's being interpreted by them as all-consuming, overwhelming, smothering. Boundaries don't solve problems. The only problem that a boundary solves is your peace and serenity in the long run. And eventually, early on, it feels miserable, actually, and terrifying and uncomfortable. But the only thing that your codependency recovery cures is your codependency. And I'll say that again. The only thing that your codependency cures is your codependency. The only thing you can be guaranteed that your boundaries does is establish a kind of a perimeter around you of what you will and what you won't tolerate. I love this technical piece in the chapter. I don't know if you like it, but I love it. I talk about Salvador Minuchin, who was the founder something called structural family therapy in the 1960s and 70s, and how we started to define mental health in terms of the way that people relate to each other instead of in the individual. And he talked about rigid, clear, and diffuse boundaries on this kind of continuum, where on the one end, on the rigid end of the boundaries, relationship styles were cut off. And on the other end, they were enmeshed. Some of you might have heard of the word enmeshed because it's a common now term in our vocabulary, in self-help vocabulary. And somewhere in the middle between cut off and enmeshed, or rigid and diffuse boundaries, there's healthy boundaries, clear boundaries, and healthy relationships. Along comes Murray Bowen, a psychiatrist in Washington, D.C., and he didn't actually evolve Minuchin's model, but around the same time, he was developing a model to describe the same phenomenon. And he said at one end of a continuum, there is a lack of differentiation. Differentiation could be understood as that balance, like I talked about in that early quote tonight, of the distance between me and you, where I get to be me, but I love you at the same time, and neither one of us have to sacrifice who we are. So the lack of differentiation is on the one end of the scale, is depicted by the number 0. On the other end of the scale, both of these are theoretically, because there really are no zeros or hundreds, or they're very, very uncommon, 1 in a million. So we all fit somewhere between 1 and 100 on the differentiation scale. And at the low end, at the 0 end, Bowen said he called it fusion, which looks like enmeshment, like too close. If you're watching me on the video instead of listening, you'd see my two fists clamped together and interlocked. That's kind of what fusion looks like. Notice if I move my right hand, my left hand has to go with it because they're fused. Disengagement, if you're watching me, I have my two fists far apart from each other, cut off from each other, non-responsive, non-communicative. So the female, excuse me, that's the wrong word. I apologize. The feminine style, which may or may not be female or male, but the feminine style is this kind of fused and meshed style. The masculine style, which might be female or male, is the cutoff or the disengaged style. And that's at the 0 end. And he said those are the same problem, just different stylistically. On the other end, on the 100 end, is intimacy, balance between self and others. And Bowen said, if you look at a family, he had words for it, and I'll try not to use the jargon, but he said if a family operates, if around a 65 on this 0 to 100 scale, right, that's what the parents are at, around a 65, that he says everybody in the family is going to be somewhere near that 65. Somewhere, let's say theoretically, between 60 and 70. Because you're the same, you're living in the same fishbowl. You're being cooked in the same soup. So if your parents were a 65, you're going to be somewhere between a 60 and a 70. Because you will learn what distance is. You'll learn to the extent that mom is upset or dad is frustrated, you'll learn by the way they model it about how you are to feel responsible for that. How distant or different are you from them? But here's where it gets interesting. What do 65s on this scale think about 90s? And what do 65s think about 45s? Well, 65s look at 45. You grow up, you go out into the world, and you start looking for a partner. And let's say you're a 65. Let's say you fit right into the kind of the middle of your family's differentiation. You inherited your parents' health and pathology, if you will, their style, their way of relating, their boundary management. So you leave and you're 65 and you go out into the world and you have a date with somebody that's a 45. What do 65s think about 45s? They find 45s very unattractive. They either find them dependent or reactive. They find them erratic, immature, unevolved. Because compared to a 65, they are. They're more enmeshed. They're prone to cutoff and reactivity or dependence more than a 65. So they're unattractive to you. You don't relate to them. But this is the most interesting thing. What do 65s think about 90s? 65 usually would accuse a 90 of being uncaring, unloving, robotic. Because to a 65, you've got to be a little bit more codependent to love. When a 90 sets a boundary, a 65 thinks that boundary is not caring, is abandonment. So the implication is if you, through your therapy work, through your experience, move up the scale, if you become more evolved, guess what the people are going to accuse you of being? The people who you've been hanging around. They're not going to say, congratulations, you're obviously evolving with maturity and insight far beyond me. That's not what they'll say at all. They'll say, you don't care. You're rude. You're inconsiderate. You're unloving. You're fake. You're robotic. You're strange. You're odd. You're different. I'm not attracted to you. I don't want to hang out with you. So when we set boundaries with our children, with our friends, we will get accused of things that we don't want to be. And if we're ready to take a step up the differentiation scale, we'll be okay with it. Some people ask me the question, if you get to be a 90, theoretically speaking, if you move up and become a 90, and it goes a lot slower than that, by the way. But let's say you somehow get from a 65 to a 90. Don't you need to explain to your 70s and your 60s family? Don't you need to explain to them what you're doing so they understand? And my answer is 90s don't explain themselves to people. 90s don't justify themselves the same way a 65 wouldn't justify to a 45. And if you feel a need to justify, you're probably not as far along as you fantasize. What I hate about this model, although I believe it to be true, I believe it to be useful, is that I like at times, like a lot of you, I'm sure, to imagine that I have married somebody much less evolved than me. I love to think that I'm 10 to 15 to 20 points ahead of my wife, especially when we're in disagreement or when we're struggling. But this model reminds me that I wouldn't have fallen in love unless we were close enough, unless the way that she related to me resonated with me enough. But because it's dressed up in a different costume than my family of origin and the surface level themes are different, I'm confused by it. But essentially, our level of codependency is close enough together that we fell in love with each other. And she would say the same thing about me, that she fantasizes that she's more evolved than I am. So the question in relationships is not about should I stay or should I go? It's not about should I anything. The question is healing the idea of what it means to be a person and to love another. And when we heal or we evolve that, the answer of what I'm going to do will be clear to us. One last story before I wrap up. I talk about the mice study from Dr. Nim Tottenham's study from Columbia University. And Dr. Tottenham talks about how they took mice and they shocked baby mice. And they paired the shock with a smell of peppermint, right? At the same time. So the baby mice began to associate the shock, the unpleasant pain, with the peppermint smell. They paired those things together. And they separated the baby mice into two groups. Some were shocked by themselves in a cage with the peppermint, and some were shocked as they sat nestled with their mothers. Then later, as the mice grew up, both of them had an association with peppermint. They released them into mazes. And in these mazes, they had different scents, smells, odors at the end of the tubes, the tunnels. Some were peppermint, some were citrus smell, some were pine smell, some were whatever the room smelled like. I guess you would call it ambient smell, right? The mice that were shocked by themselves never went toward the peppermint. They avoided it, which makes sense. But here's the fascinating result. The mice that were shocked when they were nestling their mother almost always went towards the peppermint. The conclusion is that attachment trumps trauma. If our attachment was chaotic, it was also our attachment, so we go towards it. If our attachment was cold, then we go towards cold relationships. If our attachment was over-involved, we go towards over-involvement. Or if it was violent, or if there was substance abuse, and all that comes along with that. Attachment trumps trauma. So you want to know why we as human beings go back to our family of origin, or things like our family of origin? It's because that's the only place that we also felt connected and safe. We go back like the baby mice that was shocked as it was being nestled by its mother. We go back toward mother, no matter how she was, no matter how bad or good it was. And mother or mother mice is not female. It's our primary caregivers, our primary contacts. The study showed in this instance, attachment trumps pain. We are attracted to contexts and relationships that feel and operated like those of our early attachments. So if our early contexts were chaotic, we seek chaos. If our early contexts were enmeshed, we seek enmeshment. People often think when I invite them to focus on intent and one's truth and to let go of outcomes, that they hear me advocating for passivity in relationships. On the contrary, one who practices healthy and courageous boundary setting is absolutely assertive. Honest expressions of a need, a feeling, or a truth take courage because there is no guaranteed outcome. The other person may respond with anger, rejection, judgment, hurt, or any other undesirable response. Telling the truth is a simple way to understand boundaries, and it's a prerequisite to intimacy. So what are the take-home for this evening? The self is the foundation of the relationship we have with others. And we must understand boundaries to understand ourselves and others. In this way of thinking, this is just mental health. From a mental health perspective, we don't get to be right anymore. That's a very tenuous foundation to build upon. But we do get to be a self, which is so much better. It's really a shift from fear to love. We learn how to lose. We get good at losing. Because being right isn't the thing anymore. And when they tell us we're wrong, doesn't matter. At least not enough to pull us back into the fray. We spend time with others who are interested in boundaries, to learn about boundaries. That's why I encourage you to go to Al-Anon and Coda, our therapy. And we critically look at and understand the messages about self and others from our family of origin. Because there were a lot of messages that we were passed on from our parents, that they were passed on from their parents, that are in the dominant culture of our time, that are absolutely untrue. And that the outcome of boundaries is courage, love, clarity, and serenity, and the possibility for intimacy and connection. I don't have time. We're doing a series. I don't have time to take questions because we're already over the hour. So I'll take your questions on the next broadcast. I implore you, encourage you, if you want to do this work, you can do our intensives. I am a big fan. Virtually everybody who goes would attest to the same thing. The next opening is in December, December 4th through 6th. We have an online version that's less expensive and also requires less time. So I could not believe how successful the online ones were when we started doing them in May of this year. And we're going to continue to do them long after social distancing and the pandemic end. If you have questions, go to intensives@evoketherapy.com or go to our website and click on the intensives box at the top and learn about all of our online and in-person offerings. Pursuits trips are for families or young adults. Think therapy light or sober fun, or just kind of reconnecting to conflict resolution and healthy communication in the context of adventure trips all over the world, custom designed by you in collaboration with you. We have alumni support groups for intensives participants. The next one will be December 8th at 6 p.m. Anybody who's an alumni intensive member is welcome to come. If you are a wilderness family, a parent of a wilderness client, our next online support group is November 19th. That's tomorrow night at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time. Email malia@evoketherapy.com for more information or to get the link. We ask all current parents to go to 6 12-step support groups. Any combination of Al-Anon, Codependence Anonymous, Families Anonymous, or Adult Children of Alcoholics. Also, Refuge Recovery and NAMI.org are great resources. All of our broadcasts are available on the podcast app. Just download your favorite podcast app and search Finding You in Evoke Therapy Podcast. Also, they're available on soundcloud.com on your computer. We are available on Twitter and Instagram by searching Evoke Therapy or Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find us by searching Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And the Evoke Therapy blog, it has new content each week. Both of my books are available on Amazon. I just announced the audiobook is out now. The Audacity to Be You was read by me. I narrated the body of the book. That was a lot of feedback I got after the first one, after we hired somebody to read it. So the Audacity to Be You is available on Amazon, audible.com, or iTunes. So either of the books you can find there. All right, folks, thank you for joining me. I'll be back November 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, where I'll do question and answer. Any leftover questions or any questions you have at that time, be happy to answer. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I hope kind of doing this virtual book club together, you're finding it beneficial and meaningful. So thank you for joining me this evening. Have a great week and a great weekend. I'll talk to you next week. Take care. Bye-bye.